This week, Trey Forgety from the 911 Association will be our feature interview for the show. Proxy Cannon with Carrie Roberts from Black Hills Information Security will be our technical segment. In the news, 1 million endpoints are exposed on the public internet. Microsoft file sharing services inside a porn pimping or adult dating site. We're not sure if those are the same or different. Spam botnet. WikiLeaks is in the news. Wireless hacking systems used by the CIA. And this just in, IoT is broken. All that and so much more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Brought to you by the SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security certification training and research. Visit SANS.org to explore their full curriculum and latest training offerings. Gain control of cyber risk with Tenable.io, the first vulnerability management platform built for today's elastic assets like cloud, containers, and web apps. Discover a fresh, asset-based approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities while seamlessly integrating into your environment. And improve ROI with the first elastic licensing approach based on assets, not IP addresses. Tenable.io delivers the data and context you need to secure your elastic attack surface. Start your free Tenable.io trial today by visiting Tenable.io. Onapsis is the leading provider of solutions to protect ERP systems from cyber attacks. Customers can secure their SAP and Oracle business-critical platforms from espionage, sabotage, and financial fraud risks. Visit them on the web at onapsis.com.
And welcome to the show. I'd like to introduce you to our host, who's apparently getting his ears blown off because he said his headphones weren't loud enough. Speaking of open endpoints, Paul Asadori.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. This is episode 518, and as Larry said, I am your host, Paul Asadorian. Very excited to be here in studio for this fabulous episode. Mr. Larry Pesce is here with me in studio. Welcome, Larry.
Yay.
What's going on?
Oh, it's been a crazy couple weeks.
It's just me and you in studio, man.
Yeah.
Like no one on the lines
I
via
know,
Skype
I
except
know.
for our guests.
Like old times.
Like old times. We're gonna rock this.
Yeah. We always do.
We always do. So what was I going to say? Oh, so I put a call out on Twitter and Facebook. I don't know if you saw that. The response was probably like the most responses I've ever had when I put a call out.
Nice.
Now, there's lots of reasons why we put a call out.
Yep.
Sometimes
I only saw the one on Facebook, but I didn't see the one on Twitter.
So sometimes guests cancel at the last minute.
Yep.
Sometimes there's miscommunication. Sometimes we just drop sometimes we just flat out don't have a guest for whatever the case may be.
Just
scheduling. That's why.
Yep.
And so this week we didn't have a guest, and lots of people. I'm still getting like text messages, like every possible way you could reach me. Someone has tried email, text message, Twitter, Facebook. I'm sure if I checked LinkedIn, someone was probably like, "Hey, I saw on Facebook you were looking for a guest." So if I haven't gotten back to you, I apologize because I've been flooded with messages. I will get back to you. We will. Everyone that said they want to be a guest, we will certainly try to work into our schedule. So if I haven't contacted you yet, I will. I promise. So a couple quick announcements. ITPro.tv's courses now include Computer Hacking Forensic Investigator V9, Kali Linux, CompTIA A+ 901, and Accelerated CompTIA Security Plus. Premium annual memberships include all video content as well as access to virtual labs and Q&A forums. For a limited time, special discount for our listeners. Normally it's $85.70 a month. I don't know why that's not in there, or $857 per year. And I do have that memorized, which is good. But because you're a Security Weekly listener or viewer, for a limited time, you get 30% off monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription using the discount code SW30. So go do that. Alrighty. Well, that was it for the announcements. We're going to jump into our interview, and out of the flood of stuff that I got, I chose our guest for this evening pretty early on because I thought the topic was interesting. It's something we haven't really covered, certainly had an expert as much as we're not experts, I guess. Trey Forgety is the Director of Government Affairs, in Information Security Issues at NENA, the 911 Association.
Whoa.
Trey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Paul. It's good to be here.
Excuse me. I'm just dying over here. It's fine.
You're right there.
It's all good.
I mean, was the title overwhelming?
It was very
because it certainly was to me.
Trey, you're so overwhelming. I can't contain myself right now. Thank you for responding to the call on Twitter and for agreeing to be on the show. And like I said, I thought this was an interesting topic about security issues as it relates. Now, can I say emergency services, or does it go beyond that?
So for my organization, we're actually in primarily the 911 space. So we handle the inbound calls. If you call us in an emergency, we're the folks that answer your 911 calls, locally and state-based in some cases throughout the U.S. and Canada. It does extend, though, the public safety domain to police, fire, EMS, and even emergency management. So kind of all of the above.
Very nice. So, Trey, how did you get started in information security? I know you were a physicist, a lawyer, a sailor, and an inveterate tinkerer.
So background-wise, I built a few RF amplifiers in college, just working on some laser testing. And the result of that was that when I became a presidential management fellow, there were some folks from Homeland Security hanging around, and I was the only person that walked through the door who had ever held a land mobile radio. And so it was kind of like you're hired on the spot because you're the only person that knows anything about that. So it was a room full of lawyers. So that, to find the one technical guy, I guess they were pleased with. Anyhow, I did that for a couple of years and then shifted over to the 911 side in association land and got into the security piece because my association got concerned about a panel at DEF CON. There were some guys doing something about, hacking 911. And so they said, quick, get on a plane, go see what that's about. And, I'd been kind of a script kiddie back in the 90s, and then this was just kind of a cool opportunity to jump back in.
And not be a script kiddie.
Right.
So Trey, talk a little bit about the 911 Association. So, how does the system work at a high level in terms of, is every state and local agency, is there a central organization to manage it? And, what does that management look like?
There's a quote from Marvin the robot that I like. It's I can tell you the answer, but you're not going to like it. And that's very true when it comes to 911 systems, because the answer is they're actually all sort of hyper-local. They basically got rolled out as the telephone network was maturing. So 911 started in 1968, and we're still using a lot of that same infrastructure. 911 is not a world of Ethernet switches and fiber and routers. It's a world of class 5 telephone switches and ancient databases that live on some, VMS system somewhere. It really hasn't changed a lot. The biggest things to happen in 911 since the 60s were the advent of address databases that let us find out where you're calling from if it's a wireline phone, and then the ability to take and ultimately to locate wireless calls, basically starting in the 90s. Those are the big innovations. A lot of the underlying infrastructure is still just that.
So how does it work when you pick up a landline, right? Obviously, that's the easiest case. That's still all essentially telephone switching, traditional telephone switching.
Yeah, so when you pick up a landline and you call 911, the central office switch that you're attached to does a couple of things. First, it takes your telephone number, it looks that up in what's called a selective routing database. That tells it an emergency service number, which is kind of an identifier for the zone, the part of town that you're in. This was a way back when databases were horribly expensive things that you didn't want to have tons of entries in because the computers were expensive. It was a way to cut down the number of entries in a database that you had to search. So the ESNs, might have 10,000 numbers that go to one ESN, and then that ESN points to a fake telephone number that you can't even dial. That tells the switch, okay, this is where we should send this 911 call. Which 911 center should we send it to? And then it gets sent out over a set of TDM trunks, and those are sometimes CAMA trunks, and sometimes they're like MF signaling. In the best case scenario, where you've got some more advanced folks, you might have SIP-based trunking, but that's pretty rare still.
I gotcha. So that's basically how it knows, like, when I pick up the phone, dial 911 to go to my local police station.
Right. So typically it'll go to a 911 center first, and not necessarily the cops or the firefighters, although, kind of an interesting historical quirk. Some places politically, the police officers were more powerful than the firefighters, and so they got the 911 calls. Other places it was the other way around.
Interesting.
And in still other places it's a separate service.
So, but there must be some facility to update who is called based on that area, right?
So I'm not sure I understand the question. Update like
if there's a new 911 call center, a new police station, or the location changes or the number changes, like how does that? There's an update process, obviously, right?
Yeah, there is. And this is what a lot of folks find pretty crazy, is that it's still an entirely physical process. When something like that happens, there's literally somebody going in with one of those ancient kind of wire nut screw guns and like changing a jumper on a distribution frame somewhere. Wow. When that happens. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
So how did the cell phone thing come about? And I'm curious, just from a general personal security kind of question, like when you dial, a lot of people don't have a landline anymore and they dial it from their cell phone. So how does that work? And what are the privacy implications of that, right? Like, people know where I am based on my cell phone number, right?
So it sort of, and this is actually where it starts to get really interesting, because the things that you can do once you start to get untethered from the wireline network are actually a lot more fun. So in the 911 space, we started to get wireless calls in the late 80s as people started shifting from wireline to wireless, which, by the way, just reached a very impressive point this year. We finally have 50% of the U.S. households that are wireless only. That just happened.
Wow.
Earlier this year.
In the 80s, there's those phones you had to carry in like a bag over your shoulder, right?
Yeah, the amazing thing is my boss is actually a friend of Marty Cooper's, the guy who invented them, and he still has that original brick phone that he made the, hey, this is Marty, guess what we just did kind of call. It's really cool to see, actually. But yeah, so once those calls started coming in, we had to figure out, okay, well, now how do we find them? And the first step was, well, the phone company sort of knows where its towers and sectors are. So they can start pushing into, and again, this is all still the old wireline database. They can start updating the wireline database at call time with the address of the tower and the central bearing of the sector. So it'll say like 123 Main Street northeast, if that's the central bearing of the tower. And so that was called phase one location data. It wasn't until much later, 94 and forward, basically, so the early 2000s really, that we started getting phase two data, where we could get your latitude and longitude within 100 to 300 meters, basically.
Gotcha. So,
and you asked about privacy. So that only happens when you call 911. It can't be turned on otherwise.
Gotcha. So when you first started hearing about people hacking the 911 system, what did those initial attacks look like, and how have they progressed over time?
So the first real attacks that we saw after folks started theorizing about how you could potentially attack a 911 system, the first real attacks, like most, are denial of service attacks. We've seen what we call TDOS attacks, telephone denial of service attacks, where folks just generate enough SIP invites in some cases to overwhelm the TDM stuff that's sitting on the other side of the gateway. We've also seen one TDOS attack that I'm going to be talking about at DEF CON this year that originated from a tweet and an iOS vulnerability. So that's kind of big and new for us. And then the other thing that we're seeing is a huge amount of ransomware. Being in the public sector, 911 centers don't have huge security staffs. They don't have huge security budgets, and they're vulnerable. They've got stuff sitting out there behind one basic firewall, and they're soft targets for extortion.
And that's because the 911 centers are pretty much all mostly independent organizations. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're usually part of a police or fire organization. Some cases they're independent, but they're all part of basically municipal governments.
Right. Hence the lack of security. So what are some, other than denial of service, what are there other types of attacks or more interesting ways to do denial of service? And have you ever seen that used in conjunction with some other crime in the physical world, for example?
So we haven't seen that yet, fortunately. I think in a perverse sort of way, the legacy infrastructure we live behind has really protected us because, the worst thing you can do to a telephone is make it ring. And the tools for dealing with that in terms of reputation scoring and call blocking and so forth are only just starting to develop, but they are developing pretty quickly. The nightmare scenario for us is somebody finds another iOS or Android vulnerability and gains the ability to geo-target a denial of service attack. If that happens, and especially if it happens in concert with a kinetic attack, we're in real trouble.
Yeah, because you really have no way to do like denial of service mitigation at that point, right? I mean, while the legacy gear protects you, it also kind of hinders you in the way in such a way that it's like analog, sort of, not analog, but gear that doesn't have those capabilities to dynamically detect an attack and put some kind of mitigation in place on the fly.
It's very true. The legacy TDM network does not have a lot of intelligence. There's not a lot you can do around it. This is actually one of the things that I'm going to be talking about at DEF CON this year, because defending those types of assets while we manage the transition to an IP-based next-gen 911 is going to be really difficult. We've got a lot of work to do because there's a huge asymmetry in the ability of attackers to generate traffic versus 911 centers to absorb it.
So you are making the transition to a voice over IP based system?
Yeah, so next generation 911 is actually really cool. It's even more than VoIP, actually. And this was a very forward-thinking sort of thing. So the public safety community is really conservative. They're not always known for, having the most, ideas about what things are going to look like 10 years from now. But more than 10 years ago, our organization actually started standards development work for what NG911 would look like. And when they did, they said, well, look, it's not just going to be voice. It also ought to be video and pictures and data and real-time text and all the sorts of things that consumers were just starting to use in those days. And then really after 2007 started to adopt massively. So all that sort of stuff will be ready to take once we make this transition.
That's interesting. I know today it's somewhat easy to educate people how you dial 911 and when to dial 911, although I'm sure you deal with your number of prank calls, or my son has actually dialed 911 just like see what would happen kind of thing. The operator was actually really good. At one point he said, put your son on the phone, and had a conversation with him. And since then he hasn't dialed 911 unless it's an actual emergency.
That's good.
Funny how that works. But when we move to the next generation 911, and we're able to do things like pictures and video, like how do you secure that and maintain the same level of mean, it's really on the user when they access this service or not, and how do you police that, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, so that's a big part of the transition, actually, is making sure that we can do things like that in a secure way. And so we really have security baked into the standards. I like to tell a little story. When our organization did its primary standards work on next generation 911 security, it's a document called NGSec. The NIST framework was not actually out yet. Nobody could see it because it wasn't done. But after the NGSec standard was published, we actually had a couple of government agencies call up and say, hey, how did you guys get an advanced copy of the framework? Because we didn't mean to give that out yet. And we're like, well, we didn't. And then they said, yeah, but this is way too neatly aligned to not have had foreknowledge of what was coming. So the security is baked in, but to get practical about it, we have border control functions for the network that can do things like suspicious call marking, rate limiting. In the future, you might be able to divert a call, and this is baked into the standards, to an IVR if it looks like it's coming from a place with too many calls to be real, so that you can sort of sort through, okay, what's good, what's not.
Kind of similar to how even built into Android, and then if you do something like Truecaller, it knows based on reputation and all those other things if the call is potential spam or not.
And that's the other thing, because a lot of services like Truecaller or Hiya or some of these other carrier integrated services are doing reputation scoring now and opening up APIs to that sort of thing. Border control functions could consult those types of services before accepting a call.
Right.
Interesting.
So beyond 911, are you working with any other emergency response type systems and the security or insecurity of those types of systems?
So because the 911 Center is kind of the hub around which a public safety response is built, we do work very closely with police, fire, and EMS, and even emergency management agencies. From a technical perspective, the security aspects of most of those systems fall under 911. But when it doesn't, so when you think about things like, first responder LTE, that's becoming a thing this year, actually. I'm our organization's member of something called the Public Safety Advisory Committee to FirstNet, which is the sort of semi-private public safety LTE network on some special spectrum that AT&T is building. So we do engage with our counterpart organizations from all of those fields as we talk about how we're going to secure these bigger systems.
Well, sure, because part of the communications chain obviously is someone calls 911. The 911 operator then needs to talk to local police or fire or emergency responders.
Right.
What is that? Is that communication different in all of the municipalities?
I would love to tell you that it is not, but the reality is there's a huge amount of spectrum that's given over to public safety, and it's not consistent nationwide. Different municipalities have different spectrum that they use, and in some cases even still different network technologies. There is one standardized radio technology that the federal government has been pushing really, really hard since 9/11 in the land mobile radio world. On the security front, Matt Blaze, Travis Goodspeed, and some of that crowd have done some great work, security analysis on that standard.
Is that P25?
Yeah, Project 25, exactly.
And so is that standard use encryption? Because I remember being in my great uncle's house, and he'd always have the police scanner on. I was always kind of astonished that you could just listen in, right? Is that the standard pushing towards some private communications for that? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, so kind of remarkably, it's about a 27-year-old standard. We only had a vote within the public safety community this year to require the use of a standardized and good quality cipher, AES 256. Historically, a lot of radios were sold into the market with an RC4 variant that, in addition to the limited key space, was not necessarily implemented in an interoperable or robust way. And so there was a lot of troublesome issues around that.
Larry, along these lines, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
I remember reading some of Travis and Collective's work around P25, and that some of it was actually kind of frightening on some of the potential issues that were there. around being able to break some of those, not break some of the communications, but do denial of service type of attacks and not be doing RF-based jamming. So I distinctly remember some of that type of stuff, and that it was, to me, it was fascinating how easily it was, quote, disrupted.
Yeah, the denial of service attacks they've demonstrated with very basic hardware are pretty terrifying. There is actually, given the limited key space, it is actually now feasible to break some of the non-standard encryption in very nearly real time.
Wow.
And there are bigger issues with things like integrity checking. There's really not a lot in there. You could easily do replay attacks, for example. Some of those things haven't been addressed yet, but we're working on it.
Yep. And as you mentioned, P25 was Project 25 was what, 27 years old, or was that something else?
It's 27 years old now. Okay. Yeah, it started back in the 80s.
Yep, and
so what prevents
one of those protocols shows its age when you don't think about the future, about what types of tools will be out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and what about communicating on those frequencies? What measures are there to prevent someone from essentially transmitting on those frequencies? Other than FCC regulations, I'm sure.
Yeah, FCC regulations.
Where we're going, we don't need no roads.
Yeah.
Yeah, the FCC prevents you from doing that.
I gotcha.
Also, some of the hardware manufacturers for the radios as well, they will only sell specifically tuned radios for certain frequencies to specific agencies.
I gotcha.
And if you have to be able to prove that you work for said agencies. Now, that said, this day and age, that
software-defined
radio, those things are, quote, hackable. They have firmware. You can modify firmware, re-upload.
Get them secondhand somehow.
Yep. So there's always ways.
And anybody with a $200 ham HT and a desoldering iron can basically jump on nearly anything they want.
Yep. I mean, that's what I read on the internet. And now listening is a completely different story. For the most part, listening is a passive activity and is okay, but transmitting is significantly more of an issue.
I gotcha. So are there, do you see crimes using these, abusing these frequencies for various purposes, either transmit or receiving?
So I'm really not the best person to ask about that because I'm not necessarily so much in the radio world. But what I will say is most criminal enterprises, unless they're state actors for some reason, are not all that sophisticated, surprisingly so. Most folks that are in something like this are in it for the money, and so they're going after the easy kill ransomware type attack.
Got it.
In order to, so what we discussed so far, Trey, is that technology is moving forward. However, there are a lot of state and local law enforcement agencies that have to adopt the new 911 standard, as well as provide some level of security and integrity and privacy of their communication networks within their local law enforcement. How is that all going to happen with traditionally, being underfunded and not being adopters of new technology that we have in our local state and government agencies?
So that's a huge issue in the community right now on two sides. One is the adoption of public safety broadband in the field, so LTE that they can use to start to replace some of the things that have historically been done over like P25. The good news with that is that with FirstNet rolling out, all of the capital expenditure that, where they've historically had to build up tens of millions of dollars in fund balances to go out and procure a big new land mobile radio system, all of that's going to go away. And basically, instead, they're going to just pay a monthly user fee just like you do a cell phone bill. On the 911 side, the 911 fees that we have can continue to fund the operations of the system. But like they needed a big capital expenditure by the federal government for FirstNet, we're going to need something similar for NG 911. On the order of $10 billion, basically, because it's a life-critical system. You can't just turn off the old one while you plug in the new one. You have to have both up and running for a while you test and verify, validate, get everything up and running, and make sure it's going to be stable.
Other than the cell phone or smartphone and application hacking, what are some of your primary concerns security-wise with any of these emergency response systems?
So two big ones that come to mind. Obviously, if you have anything on the law enforcement side, integrity management is huge. Making sure that you have very carefully recorded hashes of things, that you understand the algorithms that are transforming things when you compress them, for example, in a way that you can explain later on if you're asked about it in court. That's very important. Making sure that when we do accept video and photographs and other sorts of file traffic through 911, that we're careful about how we do that and we don't let it come into contact with protected systems. Those are hard problems, but they're problems that the industry is working with. Those are probably the two biggest ones.
So Trey, the 911 calls are typically admissible in court. Do you have to maintain like a chain of evidence of that stuff? And then what does that look like when we start doing video?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we have to start doing things like, embedding time codes and hashes. We have to do things like protecting the chain of custody of the underlying physical storage medium, or taking steps to use sort of certified cloud storage that we're allowed to use for that kind of purpose. These are issues that we're really sorting through right now as we start to deploy these systems. Is how do we do logging and recording when it might be used as evidence?
Are all 911 calls recorded today?
They should be.
Good answer. Good answer.
I don't know of any center that doesn't record them by default. That's not to say that there's not some rural PSAP out there, public safety answering point, that doesn't have the facility for that, but it would be very unusual if they didn't.
I gotcha. Yeah, it is really interesting.
Yeah, Trey. So Trey, taking a little bit of a different switch. Many years ago on this podcast, and I've done a lot of wireless stuff. We saw an initiative, and I saw an article that there was something proposed in Europe. Not too far after 911, when the cellular networks and all of those networks were overloaded. Just nobody could use them, including public safety, when they were trying to use that for some quote backups and those types of things. So there was some discussion about coming up with alternatives and backups, and it now sounds like we've got some public safety LTE coming in for some broadband type thing. Are there any sort of other things on the plate, given that one of the ones that was proposed there would be that if a first responder showed up in an environment that they couldn't get their connectivity, especially in a metropolitan area where something big was happening, they could essentially use some Wi-Fi gear to send out, quote, a magic packet that would trigger all of the wireless access points in its proximity to change its configuration to turn them into mesh networks, and could use back-end internet backhaul. I thought that was pretty novel, but then of course what I want to do is find the quote magic packet. So thinking about some of those, are there thoughts about proposed for backups to say the LTE stuff for the emergency services folks?
So there's a couple of interesting things that are happening. The near-term thing, and this is actually kind of a cool feature of the way the LTE stuff is going to get deployed. Even though we do have 20 megahertz of like beachfront 700 megahertz spectrum that public safety is kind of a primary LTE user on, the underlying network that they are going to have access to is AT&T's. And so in some markets, they'll actually have more than 100, up to even 245 megahertz of spectrum, all the way from 600 up to 2300 megahertz. That'll be available. So in terms of just network availability, it's going to be massively better just on an RF basis starting out. There is some spectrum set aside at 4.9 gigahertz for potential public safety Wi-Fi-like services.
Yep.
The magic packet thing, I think, for exactly the reason you identified, sort of seems to have died a welcome death.
Yep. Very good. But yeah, it's good to hear that there's plenty of quote RF bandwidth available. And then my question starts to become about reliance on some of those types of networks. Is that how long and haven't been in the situations where Paul and you and I have been through a hurricane and been without power for 4 or 5 days. What does the uptime look like for some of the support on some of those towers? So it's finite.
Yeah,
mean in the
SLA
zombie
for those
apocalypse,
services
Larry?
I mean, just saying.
In a post-apocalyptic world where there's no power.
Yeah, that's the world that our folks get paid to worry about all the time.
Yeah.
Though. The SLA for FirstNet's going to be 4 nines, so that's less than an hour of downtime in a year.
Wow.
In any given location. But yeah, I mean, we worry about that. We worry about, okay, if that goes bad, what do we do for deployables? How do we get cell on wheels, cell on light truck? There's even a lot of talk about aerostats. We're going to put up balloons to restore service quickly. Those are all real things.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I've seen some of those types of things. I remember seeing a number of years ago that it was a satellite dish on a truck that would fold up and fold out like a flower and would do relay of calls via satellite with a local cell tower and some of those types of things, which are really cool. And a buddy of mine in Florida, hurricane area, would deploy his ham radio antenna via balloon because he couldn't have a tower because it would get blown down anytime you want to use it. You throw the balloon up and it would take the antenna up with him. Very cool. Very cool.
Nice. Trey, you have not been on Security Weekly before, which means you get to answer the 5 questions with Security Weekly. Are you, in fact, ready for that?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's good.
Take a
no
shot.
one's truly ready
You're
for
never
5
ready.
questions.
You're never ready.
Trey, 3 words to describe yourself.
Sailor, tinkerer, lawyer.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
An axe.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Lost at sea. Twice.
Oh, no.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
Can you be more specific?
First or second?
Yes. And you get to choose American or European rules. So.
Yeah.
How about I'll prefer to judge the game rather than
There you go. That's
participate.
good.
Oh, all right. So you like to watch. Yes, me too.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Ooh, Sherlock Holmes and Hedy Lamarr.
Oh, very nice.
Wow. I will also say that I believe this is the first time anyone has ever picked a fictional character to be their celebrity parent.
Could be. I have to check the tape.
Yeah.
Or the
we'll get the
MP4s.
We'll get the production staff to do that, right? In all their spare time.
And Trey, you will be speaking at DEF CON 25 this year. It is DEF CON 25, right?
Yep.
Okay. DEF CON
Yes,
25.
it is.
I thought it was canceled, though.
It's always canceled.
I did hear DEF CON was canceled.
I
yes.
did. I heard that too. In your talk, what is the title of your talk?
It's inside the Meet Decide attack, defending distributed targets from distributed attacks.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you at DEF CON, Trey. Thank you very much for appearing on the show on short notice. It was wonderful having you.
My pleasure. Thanks.
With that, we're going to take a short break, come back, get Carrie Roberts on to talk about Proxy Cannon. Stay tuned.